Right, okay. Can anyone hear me? Susan said, can anyone hear me? She can't hear a thing. No. Well, we need to reply, don't we? Chat. No, we can't hear you. Right, Steve, can you reply to Sue to say we can't hear a thing? You've done it, right. Right, not an awful lot really. It's just lovely to see people during this dreadful time at the moment. Nice to see Catherine and Barry. We haven't seen you for a couple of months. That's lovely to see you. As usual, all I can say is the centre is not open as yet. Is there anything else? No, there isn't really.
Yeah, there is.
What? Oh yes, you've got something, haven't you?
Yeah, just to mention that Stephen Shearer are stepping down from their duties at the centre, and we are looking for volunteers. I know we won't get any, so we're going to approach some of you over a period of time.
They're not stepping down as volunteers, they're stepping down as managers. Is that right, Steve?
Yes, that's right. Oh, you don't get rid of us.
No. No. We'll never get rid of you, dear. Either of you. Don't want to. Don't want to. Right, so the Research Centre is not open. We are sort of busy doing our own little bits and pieces. But what I'm going to do, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Megan, who's going to talk to us about
crime.
I'm addicted to crime, is it, Megan? Yeah. Okay, unmute yourself, Megan. Oh, lovely.
Yeah, I'm addicted to crime, that's it.
Jolly
Let's see if I can do this. I might, so I need to share the screen. So let's see if I can get it going. Hopefully you'll be able to see. You see the, let's see if I can get it up. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation, everybody?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So I'm addicted to crime. So just how did this happen? This is a terrible addiction. Well, doing family history, how else do you think? Doing the family history, what did I discover? I discovered I had a horse thief in the family. John David Gambold, he was transported to New South Wales. He was the cousin of my great-great-grandfather, and he was born in 1811 in a parish just north of Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire. In 1832, in April of that year, he was arrested in Pontypridd, selling a pony to a butcher. He was taken to Monmouth Castle, and in August, he was tried at Monmouth Assizes and sentenced to be transported for the rest of his natural life. He was sent to the hulks at Woolwich, and in December, he was put on board a convict transport ship called the Mangles, which sailed for Sydney, arriving there in April 1833. From the indents of the Mangles. Now the indents are effectively like the manifest, which sort of lists the convicts, and gives you an amazing amount of information if you can read them, because they look like that. And John is the fifth one down there. It tells you their age, whether they're married, if they're married, how many children they've got, how many boys, how many girls, what their native place was, what their trade or calling, their offences, where they were tried, when they were tried, previous convictions. It then gives you a very, very detailed physical description, because obviously it predates photographs or fingerprints, so you needed to be able to identify them if they escaped. So I know he was 5'5" tall. He had ruddy complexion, black hair, hazel eyes, a scar on his right eyebrow, 2 small moles on the back of his upper right arm, 2 inside his lower right arm, and one mole on the back of his lower left arm. Thankfully, the kind folks in the archives of New South Wales actually transcribed these indents, so they're far easier to read. And they also give you a colonial history, which were those numbers that were written underneath the names, if you noticed. So you could learn a lot more information about their lives in Australia. So I know that in 1843, he married an Irish free immigrant called Mary Ann Moore. And that in 1845, he was granted a form of parole, which was called a ticket of leave. And that ticket of leave was a piece of paper which said, this is what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to travel within these certain prescribed areas. And that also enabled him to earn some money for himself. Because when you arrived in Australia as a convict, you had to work for a master, be it a government master or a private individual. And this ticket of leave enabled him to travel with an entire horse between Windsor and Mudgee in the service of Mr. Rouse for 12 months. He and Mary Ann had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who he named after his parents. Neither unfortunately survived infancy. And in 1847, he was granted a conditional pardon. The conditionality was that he could go anywhere in the world except return to the United Kingdom. There, the records might have ended, but for another thing that came online, which was newspapers. In Australia, you can access newspapers virtually free of charge through the Australian archives, a thing called Trove. I discovered a shipping list in December 1849 with him sailing from Sydney with his wife for San Francisco via Auckland, and they arrived in San Francisco in May 1850. Again, I found nothing for a very long time about what they were doing in America. But in November 1868, this is through Ancestry, I discovered that he had applied for US citizenship in Northern California. I never found out what happened to him in California, but it always struck me as a remarkable tale that this was a Pembrokeshire farm labourer who'd gone all 3/4 of the way around the world. And I thought that was a remarkable story. And it got me to wondering whether or not any of these other convicts had done anything similar. And because the record is sitting me there in front of me with all their names and all that, what they've done, and all the records, a lot of the records are online. Excuse me, I started poking around, and before very long, I got a pile of paper about 2 inches thick. So what was I going to do with it? I wrote a book called Transported. And basically, it's the pen portraits of it. There were 236 convicts on the mangles, and there's a pen portrait of each of the convicts, and that's a picture of the mangles. But in order to write the book, I actually had to do more than just investigate each of the convicts. I had to research the ins and outs of transportation, the 19th century criminal justice system. And in doing so, I made a number of surprising discoveries. Firstly, about the literacy of convicts. On the mangles, I think about half of the convicts would fall into, the majority of with the literacy. I'll start again. The majority of the convicts could at least read. It was a minority who could neither read nor write. And that really surprised me in 1832. With trades, about half the convicts would fall into the unskilled labour bracket. About 1/3 were skilled. The rest came from a vast range of trades. There were people like chemists, druggists. There was an excise officer. There were merchants, jewellers, a jockey. There were soldiers who'd been court-martialed. The ages, there was a range of ages went from 13 to 54. Enormous numbers that had tattoos. It was very popular for people to have blue rings tattooed on themselves. Some of them had enormous amounts of tattoos. What they tattooed themselves with, I hate to think. What they used as ink and the implements they used to tattoo themselves. I should think hepatitis must have been rife. There were those who'd been transported before. You'd have thought once was enough, but apparently not. There were lots who had relatives that had been transported. The sheer cost of the criminal justice system, it's astronomical. the number of original documents that have survived. And I found 4 out of the 236 who definitely returned to the UK. But there probably were more, but those are the 4 that I can actually prove returned to the UK. And I sort of came up with a little summary of this. And there are a few other issues on this slide, in addition to the ones I've mentioned. And I think the ones that strike me as the most poignant, if you like, on this are in terms of the families left behind. You can see that there were 46 married men and 11 widowers, and then between them they left 133 children behind. One of the men, the records show that his wife and children were in a poorhouse waiting to be removed back to her home parish. The problem with the records is they never mention the wife's name, they just say Mrs. So-and-so. They never give the children's names. So you'd never be able to determine what happened to them. But they're the unknown victims of all of this. They're the tragedies that are never really written about. And I'd love to know more about them, but unfortunately you won't. In terms of the relatives on the Mangles, those of 2 brothers who were transported for the same crime. What I would like to do now is to very quickly give you some examples of the different types of convicts that I've talked about in the stories, either from the Mangles or from some of the other work that I've been looking at, because I've been thinking about maybe writing another book. So I've been doing some bits of research which are a bit scatterbrained, but hopefully they'll be interesting to you. So this is John Lucock, who's one of the convicts who was transported twice. He was a 24-year-old Birmingham labourer who in July 1826 was convicted of burglary at Warwick and sentenced to 7 years transportation. But he actually spent 6 years on a prison hulk at Woolwich and then was released in 1832. But the prison hulk regime was very, very arduous. It was not a soft option at all. So he was never actually transported, but he just spent 6 years down in Woolwich on the hulks. And within 2 months of being released, he was back in court in Coventry, charged with breaking and entry, and being sentenced to being transported for life. So obviously, either it was destitution or he just was a bad one. I don't know which, never will do. After arriving in New South Wales, in 1841, he married Jane Atkinson, who was also a convict, and she was from Sunderland. He was granted a pardon in 1850. In 1856, a government notice was issued charging him with deserting his wife. He'd gone gold prospecting. She died in 1868 and he died in 1875. So neither of them ever left Australia. This is about the cost of the justice system. And this is the prosecutor, on the right, you've got the prosecutor's bill for prosecuting Thomas Cribbs, who was a cotton spinner who got 7 years transportation for housebreaking and stealing clothes. So John Stanfield was the prosecutor and he was paid £27, 15 shillings and twopence for 3 felony prosecutions, so roughly £9 a prosecution. So a lot of money in 1832. And if you look at the prosecutor's bill, you can see how, if you like, mechanised it was, because it's all pre-printed, all the charges are preset, and I don't know if you can make it out, but in actual fact, they're almost like paid a bonus. So if the felons are found guilty, and whether or not they're transported. So there's an incentive. The more you find them guilty, the more you transport. If they get them transported, you get more money. Thomas Cribbs was last heard of in Newcastle Jail in New South Wales in 1853, serving 3 months for hard labour. So that's mechanized. That's how much the sort of, if you multiply that by the number of convicts, it amounts up. And the next slide is following on from that. This is not related to the Mangles, but this was something I found in a newspaper doing some other research. And this is the Treasurer's accounts for the town of Brecon between 1813 and 1819. And it basically says that they received £746 in those 6 years. And then from there, you can pick out the various expenses, most of which go to repairing bridges and roads. But this is the elements that they paid out for, if you like, crime and punishment. So you've got bread for prisoners in the town jail, bread for the town prisoners in the county jail, how much it costs them to prosecute felons, for apprehending vagrants, the ward and watch expenditure, which is effectively the police force, and then it cost them £11 just to take a convict to Woolwich. So in total, they spent 25% of the town's income on crime and punishment. That's a phenomenal amount of money. I think that's probably higher than we spend a day on crime and punishment. This is the story of one of the convicts who came home. He was 19 years old. He was a brickmaker's labourer from Liverpool, got lots of previous convictions, and he was convicted at Chester in 1832 of stealing a coat and got 7 years. The convict records from one of the hulks give you his mother's address. I don't know any other records that you can get from 1832 where you'd get a labourer's address in that much detail. So this is another good thing for if you've got a criminal in your family. You get really, you can often find huge amounts of detail that you wouldn't find from your law-abiding ancestors. He was freed in 1839 and married Anne Byrne, and she was a convict from Dublin. In September 1849, an advert was placed in the New South Wales Government Gazette asking anybody knew about him to contact the Colonial Secretary's office, because people from England were looking for him. And obviously nobody answered it, because in December 1852, there was an advert in the Sydney Morning Herald. And that's the advert. And the advert says that if anybody can prove the handwriting of a Gilbert Cummings who worked in the dockyard in Liverpool, or of an Eliza Welch and a Margaret Martindale who were Willis's sisters, they should contact John Dillon, who was a solicitor in Sydney. From what I've been able to determine, Cummings was related to the Willisy family by marriage, and he was a merchant who traded through Liverpool. And I think he'd probably been persuaded to financially back the search for Willisy and pay his fare home. Anne Byrne died in 1858. I don't know when Edward returned home, but by 1861 he was living with Margaret and her family in Liverpool, and that was in the census. And then he died in 1864 in Liverpool. Now this particular story, John Potter, who escaped and won a pardon, is probably, in my view, the most remarkable tale from the convicts on the Mangles. He was a foundling in Shrewsbury, born in 1815, brought up in the workhouse and then apprenticed to a carpenter. When he was about 16 years old, a journeyman printer came through Shrewsbury on his way to London, and Potter thought that was very exciting, so he ran away with him. They got as far as Wolverhampton when a journeyman printer robbed him of everything, leaving him destitute and penniless. For some bizarre reason, Potter made his way to Norwich, destitute. And in Norwich, he was arrested for vagrancy and sent to jail for 2 months. And whilst he was in jail for 2 months, he got jail fever. And jail fever was typhus. So he decided that he needed to try and mend his bridges and see if he could go back to Shrewsbury. So he wrote to the carpenter and asked to be forgiven and see if he could come home. And the carpenter wrote back saying, yes, you can come home. But he never got the letter from the carpenter. So when he left jail, he decided it was worthwhile. He might as well try and go back to Shrewsbury. But he was still destitute, so he was living on his wits. And according to him, that's why he committed the burglary that led him to be in Shrewsbury Assizes in August 1832, being found guilty, sentenced to death, because burglary was a capital offence, which was then commuted to transportation for life. And this is all coming from his own, effectively, biography. He just tells us very little about his life in New South Wales, but after about 6 years, he had tried to escape and was under sentence of 2 years in irons, which is effectively working in a chain gang. But that had been mitigated to him going to work in the government timber yard in Parramatta. And Parramatta, for those who don't know, is upriver from Sydney. And from there he escaped, made his way to Sydney, and got on board an American sloop of war, signed articles, and sailed away free. The only thing he talks about in his life as a convict was he talked about the boundless depravity that he'd witnessed. It's quite tantalising, but nothing else than that. 3 months after escaping, the American sloop returned to Sydney, and the British officer recognised him, but he didn't know where from, so he got away. For the next 7 or 8 years, he sailed around the world. He worked at one time for the Hudson Bay Company and was sent to Africa. And then another ship he sailed from Greenock. And so he must have been going in and out of Greenock. And at that time, he became a Christian convert of such fervency that he felt he had to confess what he'd done. So he told the captain and the crew. And then when they reached Bombay, he went to see a free church missionary named Nesbitt, who went with him to the police magistrates, but they said they got no jurisdiction to act. The ship was going on to Calcutta, so Nesbitt gave him a letter of introduction to a missionary called MacDonald, who applied to the magistrates there, but they said the same as those in Bombay. He was then told he needed to either go to England or return to New South Wales, and that if he chose the latter, the missionaries would pay his passage. And that's what he wanted to do, but the captain wouldn't discharge him. And as the ship was going to England, that's where he went, with the ship sailing in May 1845. So he arrives in London, and the missionary MacDonald from India gave him a letter of introduction to the Reverend James Hamilton, the minister of the Presbyterian Church in Regent Square, London, and also to Sir John Pirrie, who had been the Lord Mayor of London in 1841-42, was a magistrate of the City of London and a director of the East India Company, and whose wife was a keen supporter of Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer. The letter to Sir John Pirrie survives and was included in the petition for clemency that was submitted to the Home Secretary. Potter had in fact been living under an alias of George Stanton. Pirrie at this stage was very unwell and about to go abroad for his health, but he was convinced that Potter was a good candidate for a free pardon, being a fully reformed man and a committed Christian, owning up to his crimes, particularly as he would never have been detected, but for his own confession. So Pirrie persuaded the Under-Sheriff of London, a man named D.W. Wire, to take up the case for him. So in addition to the efforts made on his behalf by Wire, there was a great deal of lobbying also done by Hamilton and the church elders from Greenock, where Potter had passed quite a bit of time before finally confessing who he really was. Sir James Graham, the Home Secretary, was first approached by Wire in November 1845, and he said he could do nothing whilst Potter was at liberty, and that Potter would have to surrender himself unconditionally. And that Potter did at the end of that month. And he was remanded to Newgate Prison, charged with returning from transportation before his term had expired. He went before the Old Bailey the next day, where he pled guilty and was sentenced to 3 months' prison plus transportation for life. His supporters continued to lobby for a free pardon, and this was granted to him on the 14th of February 1846. And the last record of him was a mention in a Christian Treasure article, which I've been effectively paraphrasing, which said that he'd given up the sea and settled in business in town in one of the distant colonies, but it didn't tell you which colony he'd gone to. So as I say, I thought that was quite a remarkable tale. So what next for me? Will I write another book about what? Women? Because there's no women on Mangles. Location specific? Well, the convicts on the Mangles, they came from all over the United Kingdom. Came from the Isle of Man as well. One came from Guyana. He was transported back from Guyana to London, and then off to New South Wales. Or more than just transportation, other forms of punishment over a longer period of time. So let's have a look at women quickly. You know, were they treated differently from men? Yes, is the answer in short order. All convicts were seen as being right at the bottom of the social order, but women were seen even lower than that. They were seen almost as being morally corrupt, particularly in the early days. And they probably weren't. They were seen, particularly at the turn of the 18th century, as being prostitutes, but most of them weren't prostitutes. They were seen as being there to provide gratification for both guards and convicts, and And later on, they actually brought in rules to stop them being treated as that. So regulations were brought in to stop the transport ships being treated, I quote, as becoming sail-driven brothels. There was lots I could go on to there about, but I shan't because we haven't got enough time about this. But they also had some fairly degrading punishments for women that misbehaved. They would shave their heads. And they invented this particular gruesome piece of equipment called the iron collar. And can you imagine having that put on you and being expected to wear that for endless days? You can't sleep in that. Men didn't get that. Yes, men get flogged, but women did get beaten as well. One of the differences, which you might say is a positive, I'm not quite certain if it was or not, was women could take their small children with them. That's probably so they didn't get left as a burden on the parish rather than being kind. As I say, women were often preached at because of their perceived lack of morals. And when, rather than being, they didn't call them houses of correction or prisons in Australia, they called them factories. And often they would get preachers and worthy individuals to go and lecture the women about their morals. And there is a very famous cartoon where the women rebelled about this. And they turned their backs on them and bared their bottoms. And this is the cartoon. They'd had enough of being preached at. So I really like that cartoon. It's like, you just shut up and stop talking a lot of drivel. But while I was doing my research into women, I came across this document, which is a list of 20 women convicts under sentence of transportation in Lancaster on the 15th of May, 1824. The top two had been there for 6 years under the 7-year sentences, and they'd just been given pardons and let out. The oldest convict is 76 on this list. But she might actually, because she's been there 3 years already, she might actually be 79, because quite often the age is shown on records are the age when they're convicted, as opposed to the age, the date of the document. So you're never quite certain. That's quite frightening, really, if you think about it. But at the bottom, there's an NB, if you can see. Number 8, Mary Partridge is a strong, healthy woman who wishes to go abroad. What on earth can that mean? So if you look up to number 8, it says Mary Partridge the elder, 52, convicted of burglary, been sentenced to death, which had been respited to transportation for life. Well, is Lancaster really that awful that she wants to go abroad? So I did some research into Mary Partridge and her story, and it's quite a story. It's quite a remarkable story, in fact. In February 1823, Mary, plus her daughters, Mary and Ellen, were sent to Lancaster Castle, charged with breaking and entering into a house in Liverpool. At April of the trial, the youngest daughter, Ellen, was acquitted of being an accessory before the fact. Mary, her daughter Mary, plus 2 other men and a woman, were found guilty and all sentenced to death, and those sentences were commuted to transportation for life. Ellen returned to Liverpool, immediately got into trouble again, and at Liverpool Court of Sessions in the July was sentenced to 7 years transportation for larceny, together with a certain John Rudd. Mary the younger was sent to the Brothers convict ship in November 1823, which was bound for Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania. Mary would have gone from Lancaster Castle. So was her sister Ellen, but Ellen would have been sent from Kirkdale Jail in Liverpool. Mary died on board on the 1st of April, 1824. Now, all the convict ships had a naval surgeon superintendent on board who kept a log, and those logs can be very interesting and illuminating. And you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation here, but the surgeon's log says that Mary was suffering from sanguineous congestion in pulmone, and adds that since on board, she had suffered in silent grief from being separated from her mother. So says her sister, who was a girl of different habits. The inference being that although she has some kind of pulmonary congestion, she did not have the will to fight it. She'd actually been in the sick bay for about 3 months with this pulmonary disease. Mary the elder was sent to the Grenada convict ship in September 1824, which arrived in Sydney in January 1825. However, before it sailed and whilst it was at Woolwich, she wrote to the Home Office before departure. And this is the letter she wrote. That's her own handwriting, and it's written to the Home Secretary. What she says to this letter was she asked him to be forwarded to her daughters in Van Diemen's Land. She knew that they'd sailed on the Brothers, and she said that they had written to her saying they had been promised that she would be sent there also. She also said that she had a son on board the Dolphin prison hulk at Chatham, and she hoped he would be allowed to follow her. His name was John Rudd, who was the chap who'd been convicted with Ellen at Liverpool. And that if this would happen, she promised to make amends. It's quite an amazing letter if you think about this, and it also tells you that the convicts were actually writing backwards and forwards to one another. They were communicating to each other, so that there's lots of bits of information you can gather from that you might not have thought about. But she obviously didn't know that her daughter, Mary, had died. John Rudd was actually pardoned from the captivity hulk in August 1828. So he wasn't sent out to Australia, and he was moved from the Dolphin hulk to the captivity hulk, which is quite a common thing that happened. When she arrived in Sydney, she was assigned to the Ogilvies in New South Wales. Now, the Ogilvies had been free emigrant passengers on the Grenada, and she'd become very friendly with them on the Grenada. Now, that might sound odd to you, convict becoming friendly with free passengers. But I actually understand that she was the cook. She'd become the cook on the Grenada, and she'd made a great friend of Mrs. Ogilvie, and the Ogilvies became quite prominent citizens in New South Wales. And through this friendship, she was able to lobby and petition the governor of New South Wales to be reunited with Ellen. And the first petitions were that she should be sent to Van Diemen's Land to be with Ellen, and that was rejected. And then subsequent petitions were for Ellen to be sent to New South Wales, and they were successful ultimately, because Ellen arrived in September 1827, and she was assigned to the Ogilvies. Ellen married one of the Ogilvies' other servants, and Mary died in 1851 and Ellen in 1854. Contemporary records describe Mary as a formidable woman, which I think is a pretty fair description of her, and a gigantic woman who stood 6 feet in her stockings. Ellen, I think, was quite a little lady from all accounts. So what I want then to look at is, I've got a draft going of a location-specific and dealing with more than transportation, but I've been stymied now because of the closure of record offices. And the location I know a lot about is Carnarvonshire, because that's where my father was from, and I spent many years holidaying there. And so it's got the snappy title, Carnarvonshire Black Caps and Transportation between 1820 and 1841. And you might think she's nuts, writing about 21 years. But Carnarvonshire was a very law-abiding county. So we've actually only got 80 cases, which is a lot less than the Mangles. In that time, there were 26 people sentenced to death, but only one was executed, and 54 were sentenced to transportation. But obviously, of those 26 sentenced to death, those sentences were commuted to different things. So some of those were transportation and others were just jail. So the majority of the convicts came from North Wales, but 10 did not. Some of them came from England, one was from Preston. One came from Ireland, one came from America. And that nearly resulted in a diplomatic incident. There are telegrams flying backwards and forwards between the American consul in Liverpool and the Foreign Office about that case. I'll deal with now with the man who was executed, because I think that throws up some interesting things about difference between today and then in different aspects. On the 19th of August 1822, he was 26 and he was found guilty of highway robbery and the attempted murder of an exciseman. So he wasn't guilty of murder. A petition was raised to try and save him. Now they call them petitions because there was no appeal courts. You petitioned the king for the king's mercy. It was sent to the king by the minister from his home parish near Capel Cerrig, and it was signed by about 30 locals. Capel Cerrig is roughly between Bangor and Betws-y-Coed on the A5, about halfway. The 26th of August, so 7 days later, it had got to London. It was sent to the presiding judge, who said, "Here is the appeal, tell us if we should grant it." On the 2nd of September, the Home Department wrote to the parish minister rejecting the appeal. And on the 4th of September, he was executed. So really tight. You think about that in terms of bureaucracy today to get, you know, to marshal the answers, the responses, the roads, and the distances between London and North Wales of getting these things. It just wouldn't happen, let alone the sort of the time frames for all these to take place. The petition was raised on the basis that he'd fought in the Battle of New Orleans in America, which took place in 1815, and been wounded there, and that later on he'd been wounded at home as well, and that also that there'd been no execution in Carnarvonshire for 20 years because it was such a law-abiding county, but obviously it failed. So it was witnessed by 12,000 people. In 1841, the population of Llanbeblig, which is the parish of Carnarvon town, was only 9,000 people. So again, phenomenal number of people compared to the size of the town turned up to watch it. He was very stoical about it, actually. And he told the crowd that they should take warning from his end, which he blamed solely on drunkenness, profanation of the Sabbath, and abandoned prostitutes. So he accepted his fate. And this is one that amused me. It was John Julian, the Irishman who insulted the judiciary and the Welsh. He was found guilty of obtaining money by false pretences and sentenced to be transported for 7 years. But he and various associates launched at least 2 appeals alleging bias, prejudice and bigotry against the Welsh jury, judicial system and the people in general. He complained that the judge's summing up had to be translated into Welsh because not all the jurors understood English. Now that surprised me that not all the jurors understood English, because I would have thought they would have been aldermen and therefore would have been bilingual. But in those days, as I understand it, the qualification for being a juror relates to property, so perhaps it wasn't necessary to be bilingual. But actually, I like the fact that there were translators in the court, because I knew that most of the defendants would not have been bilingual, and I knew that the judges, nor would the judges have been bilingual. So at least I knew that defendants wouldn't have been disadvantaged. I'm not too bothered about Mr. Julian. One of his associates suggested somehow or other that the Welsh jury, as he called them, were all employed by and thus influenced by the Bangor banker. Dun, 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 dun. I think the Bangor banker was the man who'd been swindled, but I don't think they could have been influenced by them. Julian wrote to the Marquis of Anglesey, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and he said, "Your petitioner is emboldened to address your lordship on this his unfortunate situation, from his knowledge of your lordship's connection to this country, but you must be aware of the manner in which the laws are administered by ignorant men, biased by certain natural prejudice and actuated by a spirit of ill will towards every person not of their own country and acquaintance." The appeal was destined to fail because it impugned the judge, the jury and the judicial system, something that was never ever done. Appeals never challenged the validity of the verdict. They never impugned the system. If you were going to appeal, you didn't appeal. You threw yourself on the clemency of the mercy of the king, and you really asked for clemency of the sentence, clemency to be able to serve your sentence in this country, or a reduction in the sentence. You never challenged the verdict. So it was never going to work. So he was a lost cause before he started. I thought you'd like to know a bit about Lancashire. So I did a bit of research on Lancashire in 1826. I just picked the year quite randomly. And you can see there's quite a difference between Lancashire and Carnarvonshire. And you can see that in 1 year in Lancashire, I should say that Lancaster had a fearsome reputation as a hanging town, by the way. It said that more people were hanged in Lancaster than anywhere in the country, save for London. There were 2,380 trials in 1826. You see, most of them were men rather than women. You had a pretty good chance of being found guilty, as you can see. The no bill means that basically there was not enough evidence to be presented at that time but it left the door open if the prosecutors wanted to bring a charge another day. In terms of punishments, well, I think fines you can almost discount because there are only 4 of those, but imprisonments range from 1 day to 3 years. You can also get a whipping, either 1 or 2 whippings. Now, I've never quite worked out what a whipping consisted of because it doesn't seem to be prescribed as to the number of strokes. So, transportation, it was always either 7 years, 14 years or life. And then death. There were 96 death sentences passed that year, and only of whom 4 were executed. But if you compare that to Carnarvonshire over the 21-year period, you had 54 transportation sentences versus 288 in 1 year, 96 death sentences versus the 26. And obviously, there's a difference because of the size of the population and the industrialisation of Lancashire. But there is a particular issue, as you're going to see in a minute, as to why this was a particular year with so many death sentences and so many transported. So these are the crimes and I've grouped them together just to make it easier, otherwise there'd be too many. And some of them you will recognise, some of them you might not recognise. So, you know, being at large under sentence of transportation, body stealing, classic 19th century crime. Very popular crimes at this time were the counterfeiting of coins, forgery, fraud, highway robbery. The one that's unique to this year is the machine breaking, and we'll come on to that separately, I think, talk about that. You can see there are only 5 murders. I say only 5, but it's not many, is it? Poaching, these were the offences against the game laws, which were ramping up in severity at that time. Stealing lead affixed to a building, that was a very common crime as well this time, but the biggest number were theft. So these are the crimes where death sentences were commuted. So you can see again, it's the machine breaking is the one that dominates here across there. And that's what I want to come on to talk about later on. So what if you got a death sentence and it was commuted, what happened to you? Well, it's a huge range, as you can see here. There's anything from 3 months hard labour to life, just being transported for life. And for everything other than, again, put machine breaking to one side, basically anything here relates to your previous criminal record, your previous, what they knew of you as a person. The machine breaking, in my view, was politically motivated. They wanted to make examples of people. The rest of it is about, well, this was his first offence, or this wasn't his first offence, because the sentences, like the animal theft ones, they were mandated by law. The death sentence was a mandate, and then the rest was based off the judge's recommendation, the respited sentences. The wounding down the bottom there, unknown. I've not really been able to work it out properly, and I think he was insane, and I think he ended up in a lunatic asylum, I think. So transportation outcomes. What happened if you were sentenced to be transported? Well, some of you may not know that you could actually be sent to Bermuda. Well, this is the men, anyway. They were sent to Bermuda because they used the convicts to build the naval stations out there. It wasn't a nice place to be sent. In fact, it was a very unpleasant place to be sent because of the climate. Neither the convicts nor the prison guards liked it. They were housed on old boats out there, old ships, again, hulks, and there was quite a high death rate out there because of the climate. They could spend their time in prison, either locally, like Lancaster, or they could be sent down to the General Penitentiary, which is also called Millbank, and that was on the banks of the Thames. And today you'll find it's where Tate Britain stands. Or they could spend their time on the hulks, which would be on the Thames, the Medway, down at Portsmouth or at Plymouth, Devonport, places like that. or the bulk of them were transported to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. So machine breaking. This is the unique one to 1826, and this really is actually the mill riots that afflicted this part of the country. And these weren't really part of the Luddite movement. They arose from pure hardship and destitution in the April of that year. Wages had dropped by about 2/3. Food prices had doubled. Unemployment in some areas was 60%. People were working ridiculous hours and still needing poor relief. This had been going on for 10 years or more, but it had really deteriorated badly in the last 18 months. The appeals to government had fallen on deaf ears. Rioting broke out in April and continued over several days, with the mills being attacked and destroyed. Newspaper reports say that at times the mob was about 20,000 strong. They say that 1,139 looms were destroyed in Accrington, Oswaldtwistle, Blackburn, Darwin, Rossendale, Bury and Chorley. The mill here was Lightoller and Harrison on Water Street. There were 6 people killed by troops in Rossendale, many more wounded. There were government agents in the mob who acted as witnesses against the 68 people who stood trial at Lancaster in August. They may well also acted as agents provocateurs. The mill owners were compensated via levies on the rate to enable them to restock the mills. And somebody has done a study which says that between May and September 1826, 35 children under the age of 4 died in Haslington. Between December 1826 and March 1827, there were 107 people buried in Haslington churchyard. And that can only be through starvation. After all this, a number of manufacturers subsequently agreed to pay a standard rate to the weavers, but on their own admission it was a starvation wage. The manufacturers who stuck to the agreement found it difficult to compete with those who didn't stick to it. So there were those who were paying below starvation wages. And they appealed to the President of the Board of Trade to introduce a legally binding minimum wage. But his response was dismissive. And he expressed the view that to introduce such a measure would be a vain and hazardous attempt to impose the authority of the law between the labourer and his employer in regulating the demand for labour and the price to be paid for it. It's pretty appalling, really. I'm sure that somebody could do a whole presentation on this subject ad infinitum. Even the judge was who sentenced these guys to death before commuting their sentences to life for transportation for life, was actually quite sympathetic. But he felt he had no choice. I've got an article from a newspaper which is a transcription of his speech, but I haven't got time to read it out because we're overrunning probably. It's quite a long speech, but it's quite a sympathetic one. I can let people have that if they'd like it. I don't know which newspaper it's from, but it was printed in Glasgow, so it's probably one of the regional papers. So I want to conclude now by just telling you that this is why I'm addicted to crime, because I'm just fascinated by these stories. It gives me, an insight into daily life that I really wouldn't be available to me as just a normal family historian. I would just concentrate on my own law-abiding family, apart from John David, of course, who wasn't law-abiding. And I am addicted because I float like a butterfly. I pick up bits here and there, and I really need to decide to focus what I should focus on and concentrate on next. So just watch that space, and thank you very much for listening. And I hope I haven't sent you to sleep. And if you've got any questions, please ask.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was brilliant. Anybody, any questions? Just stick your hand up and I'll slowly look and see if anybody's got their hands up.
Pauline has.
Pauline, come on then.
Yeah, it's a comment rather than a question. Megan was saying how high the literacy rate was, particularly reading. Well, about that time, the Sunday schools were going and children were taught to read. They weren't taught to write. Particularly John Wesley sort of said, oh no, you can't teach them to write. It's going to spread sedition and all this type of thing. but you can teach them to read so they can read their Bibles.
Yeah, you're probably right, Pauline. Yes, yeah. It's just sort of things you go along with preconceived ideas, and then you find something you think, woo.
Yes.
And it's doing this that I'm constantly doing. Woo.
Yeah, yeah. But certainly that I know that happened. I actually had what was it? 3 times great granddad was done for sheep stealing. He ended up with 18 months hard labour. And I think it was something like 2 months of which, or 3 months of which, had to be solitary confinement to be taken 2 weeks at a time.
Yeah. Yeah, it is quite amazing. It's quite amazing just how much of these records still survive.
Yeah.
And if you can actually find, I mean, different jails have different levels of information that exists.
Yeah.
Some of the jail records that exist in different jails are incredible amount of detail. Not all the jail records have existed, but some of the jail records are fascinating. They'll give you huge amounts of detail about where they were living and who arrested them and when they were arrested, and just fast, and all sorts of things you can find out.
Yeah, unfortunately, Cambridge records. In Victorian times, it was the Victorians who destroyed the jail records, which was unusual, we thought. It's a shame I've no physical description of them or anything.
Susan, you've got your hand up.
Did she? Oh, yes, she has. Or is that her saying it's a good show? It was a good talk. Yeah.
Susan?
Can you hear me, Mother?
I can hear you.
She's there, but she's very faint.
Yeah.
You're very faint, Susan.
Put your volume up. Or unmute yourself.
No, she's not.
I'm unmuted. I'm having problems.
Still can't hear you, love.
It's okay. Forget it.
No. You want to put your question into chat and we'll ask it for you?
That'd be an idea. What?
There's 3 in the chat already.
I think Sheila's got a question.
Unmute yourself, Sheila.
Yeah.
Where did I find all these records? Oh, that's from Susan, right. There's a whole raft of different places, Susan. You start, Find My Past is a good starting point, and then, because they're the sort of starting point, then Ancestry, but then you have, some of the records you have to go to the local record office. And there are some records you can only get down at Kew, because if you want a record, if your ancestor was tried at the assizes, you have to the only place the assize records can be seen are at Kew, but it varies. Find My Past and the letter from Mary, that was from Find My Past.
Sheila?
Oh, right. Mine is just basically to say Manchester have a fabulous site from Find My Past on records of people that were arrested in Manchester. I found my great-grandfather celebrating his son being born, went out and got drunk and was arrested. And it gave him a full description. And after 60 odd years, I found out why and who I got my red hair from. His height, his complexion, the colours of his eyes and the colour of his hair was the male version of me, even to the height of 5'4.5". I had red hair, freckled complexion, blue eyes, but he did have a lot of scars. That was the Manchester records, which were excellent.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to use Find My Past records, if you have a subscription to Find My Past, if you go into them and you go to the A to Z of records, you type in crime, you'll see crime and punishment comes up, and you then then start searching for crime and punishment rather than just searching a general search, because that narrows down the field quite a lot. You can also bring up under crime and punishment the subsets, but start with crime and punishment and start with a rough year, a name. You know, if you've got a rough year, that's when you'll find it. Yeah. The letter from Mary Partridge would have appeared in I think either HO13 or HO17. I can't remember which one now, but one of those. They're all national for them. Home Office records. They're all Home Office records. So.
Yeah. But they even make just interesting reading.
Oh, absolutely.
As you say, you've picked up on other people and just picking somebody else's and find out, oh, these two women were both arrested at the same time, both worked in the same factory. They both had a fight in the factory, so they were arrested, you know. And you can just make up a story quite easily with the...
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Some of the records are, some of the letters are pitiful. Others are quite funny. I mean, you know, there's...
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Yeah. I think Anne's got a question. Jane and Anne got their hands up.
Go on then, Anne.
You have to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted? Unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Right. I've recently discovered an ancestor, a great aunt, who was charged with murdering her son, actually, when he was about 8 months old. She had a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, and the 8-month-old baby. I mean, it could have been postnatal depression or whatever, but she was actually charged at Liverpool Assizes and then was sent to Whittingham. Now, where would I, because I'd like to find out more about, you know, that,
when it was?
the hearing. I think it was 1911. 1911.
Newspaper.
It should be, well, if it's the size...
I have managed to get a little newspaper cutting. I did manage to get that from Ancestry. Somebody else had located that. But what could I find out more about the hearing at Liverpool?
If it was the Assizes, then it would have to be from Kew.
Would it be Kew? Right.
If it's the Assizes, if it's
yes,
the
it was.
Session, you're sure it's the Assizes, not the Court of Sessions?
No, it was definitely Assizes. Yeah, it said it in the...
It would have to be Kew.
In Crewe. And what about Whittingham Asylum? Where would I find information? Would that be held at maybe, would it be Preston Records Office?
Like,
do you think that?
Sure, guys.
Right. Okay.
But I don't hold up a lot of hope for information about individuals necessarily.
Oh, really?
Islands, quite often the individuals are just listed under with their initials.
Really? It'd be interesting to find out around that period, just to get a feel for what was going on at Whittingham and, you know, the conditions she was kept in, and whether I've not actually managed to find out whether she was actually ever released from there. She probably wasn't really, but, you know, maybe even find her death records. I've only, like I say, recently found it out.
If you give me her name, I'll see if I can find anything out for you.
Oh, right.
Give me a name. And...
Yeah, right. Well, she was either known as Katie or Catherine. And it was, her married name was Whelan, Whelan.
Well, I've got to find a pen just to make sure.
Ron has a pen.
Sorry, everybody. That's why I was on mute earlier on. I've got a foster dog and he's got a bit of a problem.
Oh.
Katie Whelan.
Yes, she's either referred to as Katie in some cases or Catherine with a K, and Whelan, Whelan.
That was 19.
I think it was 19. Wait a minute, 19. No, I think actually I'm getting confused. It was 1901, 1902. I think might have been. It was around that period where the hearing was, and it was Liverpool.
And McKeever.
Yes.
ET Internet.
Yeah, .com. Yeah. Oh, that would be lovely, yeah, Megan.
I'll see if I can find it again. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah,
right.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem. I spend a lot of time looking. I might not find anything, but I'll see if I can.
Well, I found your whole talk very fascinating. Yeah. Absolutely, really interesting. Thank you.
And great. I just butt in. If you just Google Whittingham,
yeah,
Whittingham Asylum, Whittingham Records, there are kind of groups that are interested in Whittingham.
Oh, right.
So they might help.
Yeah. Oh, I'll try that then.
Obviously, you can get at the archive records online, not the index.
Yes.
So very, very easily you can find out what they've got.
Right.
You might have to go and see it, but you can at least research. Oh, yes, they have got individual records of 1901, or no, they haven't.
Right.
But it'll certainly going.
Oh, that's
randomly.
good. Right. Well, like I say, it's early days. I've only recently found out, but I've certainly got quite a bit of work to do. So thank you for that.
There's a talk for later on.
Yeah, maybe.
Any more questions? Give me a wave. Oh, hang on, Susan's come in. Don't know about Whittingham, but Prestwich.
Right.
And I've just lost the chat. Let's have a look. Prestwich are a great deal on inmates. They are at Preston as well.
Ah, right.
Give up hope. Anybody else?
Jane.
Any questions?
Jane, have you got a query, or are you just waving?
Or Jane and Carl.
Currently being indexed.
On mute.
Press switch.
On mute. That's it.
When we went to Tasmania, we went to one of the complexes where the female convicts were sent. We had a tour around it, and it showed their living conditions and the way they were treated, and they were sold off to farmers and that, young girls, most of them.
Yeah.
But the cells they slept in, they were only the width of their body and the length of their body. There was no, that was just what they slept on, a straw sack in one of these. They were like just stone buildings.
Yeah.
And a sack of straw, wasn't it? And they slept in there. There was nothing nice for them. But they worked in there as well. They took in all the local laundry and done washing and everything. And it was really interesting because the people that showed us round, they were dressed in the same way, costumes that they wore in them days. But I have the book somewhere, but I didn't realise we'd be talking on it tonight. But if I find it, I'll let you see it. But it was really interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, I started some of the stories I've picked up. I've started looking at women, and some of the stuff I picked up about the way some of the, it wasn't just that. I mean, obviously, male convicts were horribly abused.
Yeah.
Because the punishments that were meted out to convicts were horrific. I mean, some of the floggings just. I mean, but they're all based on army floggings.
Yeah.
I said about some of the soldiers being caught, who were court-martialed, who were transported. There was one soldier who was court-martialed, and I found his record of court. It's like an index of all the court-martial records. And he was transported for 7 years, but above him there's a soldier who was who faced a court-martial for theft, and he was sentenced to be flogged 500 times. How can you flog somebody 500? I mean, I literally got that, and you look at it and you think, well, he wouldn't have been alive, would he? No. I mean, it's so. If that was the mentality that they were applying, then the convicts themselves didn't stand a chance half the time. And there were some convicts I think would have been so brutalised because the ones who fought the system, who were repeatedly flogged, and I've got there's some of them book you can find them that were just flogged time after time after time, 50 lashes, 100 lashes, 50 lashes, 100 lashes, and you just think, well, they must have been like animals by the end of it.
Yeah.
There were those who didn't. there were those who didn't, and you could also see, and because they kept logs of these punishments, there are those who were inflicting the punishments who were obviously deeply affected by it, because some of the ones who've written it down, you can see from the accounts how deeply affected they just don't think it's necessary. But that was how life was. But some of the stuff that was, I mean, some of the stories I've seen about women and the way that women were, it's fair game. And it was basically mass rape at times.
Yeah, they were dehumanised. They had no privacy. Even the toilets was open.
Yeah.
If they went to the toilets, the men stood and watched. There's no privacy whatsoever.
We've got a small book that we bought when we was there about it, so we'll let you have a read of that when
Thank you.
Get out for it. About Whittingham Hospital, I got my great-great-grandmother's death from there, so there is records and they're at Preston. Anyway, that's it.
Apparently, there quite a lot that was sent to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. That was worse, wasn't it, than the main ones on the mainland?
Yeah. Yeah,
well, there was slightly different systems, because also you see, it sounds a bit bizarre, but if you were on, you could get transported from New South Wales. You committed a crime.
Yeah.
And then, actually, the worst place to get sent to was Norfolk Island.
Yeah.
All right.
The thing is, with the people in Tasmania, they didn't want to know that they were related to a lot of these convicts.
No.
And it's only now they realise they've got a history that they will actually admit that they're convict ancestry.
Yeah. Yeah, but there are lots of them want to know, because it's like, yes.
We're in denial for years that they ever had convicts in the family.
But also, what perhaps a lot of people don't realise as well is that some of the convicts who were freed after they'd done their time, they could become free by servitude, actually went on to become landowners.
Oh, yeah.
And then had their own convict servants.
Yeah.
Like in any society, you get good masters and bad masters. And so, it's quite possible some of the worst masters may well have been former convicts. It's the same as any human nature is good and bad everywhere you go, isn't it? I don't, tragedy as it is, I don't think you can apply today's standards to yesterday. And within the book, there two of the convicts were hung within a couple of years of arriving in New South Wales for murders they committed. Another two were murdered. So
they didn't learn then. Am I working? Is my microphone suddenly working?
Yes.
Hear you.
Yes.
Well, what happened there?
We can't see you.
No, I had to come on the computer inside. I don't have a webcam. The laptop was playing up. So they obviously didn't learn if they, what's the word? They were hung, they were punished for another crime anyway, so they didn't learn from the first time.
Well, no, I think some of them. Some of them weren't very bright. Some of them were, it's like if you had the whole raft of human nature. You had those who had fallen on hard times, because you had those. One of the convicts on the Mangles was the 13-year-old who stole them apples.
Yeah.
And then you had that was just hunger. You had those who were hardened criminals.
Yeah.
So you had the whole range.
Yeah.
And it's Georgian times, isn't it? Which is pre-Victorian, but it was Georgian times when the punishments for crimes against people's assets, belongings, went sky high, didn't they? That's when they started sticking in the death penalty and everything. Because
that's right. They called it the bloody code.
Very materialistic people. Yeah.
just going back to Whittingham Hospital, I've just been having a look on the computer here. Some of the records are at the National Archives, Whittingham Hospital. And one thing which you might, apparently it's at Lancashire Archives, is the burial records. You're muted.
You're muted, Anne. You're muted.
Oh, right. Oh, that's good to know. I shall make a note of that, actually, because that would be, I really would like to find out, you know, whether she died there or whatever. So,
yeah,
Lancashire
on the
Archives.
Lancashire Archives site,
Yeah.
With hospital, you'll find out what their holdings are. But
right.
Again, the problem with Lancashire Archives is that their records are not accessible at the moment because of the COVID-19. You need to go to Lancashire Archives.
It's worth emailing though.
Yes, that's true.
Try emailing them. Because I know Stephen there was always going up into the stack to look for various records for people.
Yeah.
Right.
So
okay. Right, thanks for that. Thank you very much.
Some of the offices, I mean, I know the National Archives has opened up again, hasn't it? It is taking in, if you pre-book, I mean, it's a long way to go.
If you go there, yeah. Some National Archives records have been digitised, and you can, for a price of £3.50, I think it is, you can order those. But
having the free downloads,
But it all depends whether these particular records are available on National Archives. Are digitised on the National Archives.
I think they've been concentrating on war records recently, digitising those.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned in your talk, Megan, was the fact that the families were left behind.
Yeah.
Now, if a wife refused to follow her husband within 7 years, he was entitled to marry again in Australia, legally.
Not necessarily.
When I got a milestone, went out to, sorry.
But it depended on the authorities. It depended, because it depended on what sentence he'd got, and it depended on the authorities. Because a man could apply to bring his wife out free of charge.
Yeah.
After a period of time, and if he was of good character and she was of good character.
Yeah, but if she refused,
well, she might refuse. But then if he then subsequently went to apply to marry out there, and he was still he wasn't free by servitude, in other words, he hadn't got his certificate of freedom, he hadn't got his pardon. They could he still needed the approval of the authorities to marry. If his record said that he was married back in the UK, they could say, no, you're married, we're not going to let you marry. Depending on how nasty they wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lots of, but lots of them took bigamous wives. They just went off. They didn't, after they were free, lots of them went off and married. There's lots of, I've got a couple in the book where they were definitely bigamous marriages. And equally, there were plenty of wives who stayed behind who married bigamously.
Yeah.
I lent Pauline a book about bigamy, didn't I?
Yes. Yep.
Bigamy was actually very common. It's much more common than people think.
Oh yes, I've got it in my family.
Because people couldn't afford divorce.
No.
Divorce wasn't available to people, so they just, and lots of people thought you could do this if you both mutually agreed to it, or if you've been parted for 7 years or whatever. Had lots of misunderstandings of what you could and couldn't do, and the law actually took a very lenient view of it, providing that there wasn't any maliciousness about it. Because yes, you could get 7 years for transportation for it. But you'll find lots of cases in the book that I lent Pauline, which has been written by a law professor, shows that loads of cases where people just got a day in jail or a week in jail. Very light sentences, because there was no maliciousness about it. Where they tended to get the harsh sentences is where they were basically marrying where a man married a woman, took her all her possessions, and then went off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because obviously, as a man married a woman, and it suddenly became the owner of all her possessions.
It's not just bigamously marrying; it's theft as well. So, and probably a lot of other things. Do we have any more questions, please, folks? Unmute yourselves if you do. Right, are we going to give Megan a nice thumbs up sign? I think so. Well done, Megan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Right, well, next month, I believe it's me, is it? Give me it's me, yeah. I don't know what the subject is yet, but you will find out later on. I will come up with something, so it's going to be a surprise, folks.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, folks, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Don't forget the
thank you.
September the
3rd.
Right.
Quiz night, September the 3rd.
7:30.
Right.
Hopefully we will.
Thank you.
We will see that we're actually camping in North Yorkshire. But we always take the computer with us, so.
Bye-bye.
Okay, folks.
All right. Bye, Megan.
Bye.
God bless. See
you.
Bye, Susan.
Bye. Bye. As you can't see me, I'll go now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Steve, before you go, you're still there, Steve, yeah?
Yeah.
What I did during the presentation, I don't know if you noticed, I spotlighted the video. So it would always be on the speaker. If you click on any of the people, one of the options that comes up is spotlight the video.
Yeah.
So
I had learned that this last month and totally forgot about